Hello Jen, it's May 31st and I'm making this video in Toronto. I'm back home for a couple more weeks before I fly back out. And I had been thinking a lot about what kind of videos I wanted to make for this channel, and I was having a total mental breakdown because I realized every single thought I had seemed to have been expressed somewhere else in a more interesting way. And I think I had been chasing after this idea of the original thought, or the perfect thought, the perfect original thought, because it felt like if I was going to put the effort into trying to share some sort of idea with you, it had to be something that you had never thought of before, that actually felt like an original thought. And so, of course, given this insanely difficult request I had for myself, I decided to resort to what anyone in the 21st century would resort to, which is the internet, and in particular, Substack. A lot of our friends are on Substack, and I feel like some of the most interesting people I know will like start a Substack and then just like write things on it. So I figured probably this is the best first step. And so I spent a lot of time on Substack. I want to say like many hours a day, just like scrolling through blogs that seemed to be at first very interesting. Often they would have very good titles and they would have sort of distinct ideas that actually made a lot of sense and were like genuinely intriguing to think about. What I quickly realized though was that a lot of these Substacks kind of just talk at you in like a monologue form almost, even if they're interesting. I think there are like some very interesting, well-crafted Substacks that are like creative writing, I guess. But I think when it comes to the actual transmission of interesting ideas, Substack's kind of a bad medium for this because it's really easy to think you have an original thought and you can get away with writing 500 words about that thought. And I thought, okay, so if I don't want my videos to end up like a Substack, how do I work around this? So I kept looking, and I figured there'd be a Substack somewhere that was like genuinely novel and interesting. And I won't say I didn't find any that felt like new or made me think about things in a new way, which you could argue is an original thought. But it did just feel like the medium itself didn't incentivize like genuinely novel thoughts. It incentivized good writing, which maybe is just what Substack needs to be. But the thing I found really annoying was that the way the Substack like feed algorithm works is that a lot of times people would repost blogs and they would say in the caption, "This was the best thing I've ever read in my entire life." And it almost became a joke because every time I would open my feed, you would see right on the top like 3 articles that were like, "This is the best blog I've ever read in my entire life. Oh, every human should read this blog if they care about their loved ones." And I'm sure other people have noticed this, right? I cannot be the only one who's like, guys, most of these are just like diary entries from like a 17-year-old, and you've like framed this in like this weird like, oh, this is the best thing ever. And part of this is probably because people just like are incentivized to gain reach, gain audience, so they'll go out of their way to get people to repost their stuff like this. But also this kind of is just not true. Like these thoughts aren't interesting and aren't novel. And this got me thinking about the internet because I do just consume a lot of media, and it's mostly not that novel. And let me backspace a little bit. So once I realized I didn't really have good ideas for my video, I started to think about what good ideas I ever had ever. And I started thinking about all the interesting people around me who I felt could always be talking about ideas in a way that seemed novel and interesting that I just didn't feel like I could do. And maybe I'm being too unfair, and I'm sure I can do this, but I thought, okay, look, if I'm gonna go to a party and I'm gonna have an interesting conversation, wait for that car to pass, then probably I need to be looking for sources of information that I genuinely find interesting. And where did my mind go after Substack? It went to Reddit. And then I thought, okay, Reddit I got when I was maybe 15 years old. And at the time, it was genuinely mind blowing because it felt like a massive community of so many different people. It was a million micro communities, really. And so it didn't feel like there was a very, very strong sense of groupthink because you could just find people who thought very different things about each other. And so I was on Reddit a lot at the time, and I thought, okay, maybe I'll go back and see if I can find more novelty there. But then what you realize is even if there's micro communities, they're all sort of homogenized by the same fact, which is that they're all on this platform which very clearly incentivizes a certain way of thinking and speaking. And so even if you have people who have completely different opinions and thoughts, you'll end up finding that they frame things in the same way, have the same sorts of discussions, and basically every new post on Reddit seems to be just like a duplication of all of the other posts on there, but with like slightly different contextual relevance. And so are you really, are there any new thoughts, or are there just like different versions of the same thought on this app? And then I did spiral because I realized then that the 5 apps that I used every day for most of the days basically provided me with no genuinely new form of media to enable original thinking. Basically, every single one of them was kind of doing the same thing. And you could say this about like YouTube, you could say this absolutely about Instagram and Facebook, but mostly say this about anything that requires some sense of duplicable media. And this really made me think, okay, maybe the problem isn't me, the problem is the internet. And I know this is not a novel thought. There's like a million blogs on this. There are so many articles about this. There are so many people who are obsessed with the fact that having an original thought is just like not possible anymore. But to me, and I think it makes sense to me because the roles of consumption and creation have kind of switched in my head. And here's what I mean by that. Consumption for so long has been something we do in order to be able to create something with that, right? So if we consume media, yeah, we do it for its own sake. We also just do it because it like is a way for information gathering and for developing ideas and for learning new things and gaining perspective and being able to operate within new paradigms through that perspective, right? We consume because it teaches us. But this is no longer like the baseline reason why people consume media. They consume it for entertainment, for its own sake. They consume it to be satiated by it. And what this does is it incentivizes the sort of content that is satisfying on its own, for its own sake, and not content that is difficult to understand, difficult to consume, difficult to digest, but actually has massive instrumental value, right? So this is the Instagram reel, this is the Substack diary entry that is fun to read, but doesn't really enable the sort of required engagement that allows for you to harvest like other value from it. And on the flip side, I think creation, I've noticed, has been something that used to be done, I guess, to some extent, at least maybe in my immediate space, in my immediate community. It feels that creation was once done for the instrumental value of producing that thing in order to be able to help inform people, help evoke emotions, or something else of that sort. But I think it's pretty easy now to create things without having consumed things, and in doing so, to create things for their own sake, but not really because you're interested in the instrumental value. And I don't really think this is always true, but I think I foresee a world in which creating content won't really have a barrier at all pretty soon, and then you can create things for the sake of creating them, but creating them with purpose no longer seems to be the incentive. You can create a blog because you want to create a blog. You can essentially do all the work of creating the blog without really thinking about it, but feel the satisfaction of having created the blog. And now that blog, pretty low effort blog, can become engaging to other people because A, you can have AI help you make it, but also B, people aren't really deeply engaging with content in the same way they were before anyways. So you can kind of just write anything and people will just kind of look it over and it'll be fine. And this reminded me of recently one of my friends asked me to look over this research proposal for her, and I began reading it and I realized that it was essentially a copy-pasted ChatGPT. It was kind of jarring to me to feel that this person hadn't really looked over their own work and hadn't really shown the interest in caring for the work that they had now put upon me to review and to engage with. And so as readers, of course, if we think that people are going to be putting in a lot less effort into the content they create, what incentive do we have to engage with it deeply or critically? And what ends up happening is if you're gonna try to look for original thoughts in the way that I think I've tried pretty hard in the last little bit to do, you're forced to engage with a lot more garbage than you ever were before. I mean, like 200 years ago, if you were reading a book, someone put a lot of care into writing that book, and a lot of thinking had to go into producing the final manuscript and having it reach you in a way that you would actually want to engage with it, right? Now, I can open my phone and there's like a 7,000 word Reddit post that someone just wrote on like a ketamine high, didn't really pay attention to, and didn't actually have any instrumental or inherent value for me, but exists right in front of me, and because it's so accessible, I will consume it. And so as a person with a finite intellectual capacity, it almost seems to me impossible now to be able to like seek out good media without becoming trapped into one of those systems that engage you in very homogenous forms of media, right? If my heuristics require me to rely on a certain source of content in order to ensure that it's going to be original content, then it's going to become content that I've seen already before, because it's coming from the same sources that it was coming from before. If we wanted to enable like a wider access to original thought, we'd have to completely restructure the way we're creating media, which I mean isn't going to happen anytime soon because we're all obsessed with AI. And a couple of days ago, I found this article about this guy who wrote this book. I forget what it was called. I'll link it here. But he was basically saying that we didn't have lack anymore. There was I think he said a loss of lack. And it seemed, what he was saying was that we no longer feel an absence of anything, of satiation of any kind. And this, again, I think this is like what every New Yorker homepage ever always says. It's like, oh, we don't know how to feel bored anymore. And this is true. But also, I think, what a profound moment to exist in, wherein the lack of lacking has become the problem. I just think there's something so almost poetic. The thing that has kept us sane and that has let us prosper for so long, this like thirst for consumption of things that actually excite us or make us happy or make us want to keep going, is going to become the reason that we collapse in on ourselves as a society. And the reason I say that is because it's not clear to me that people born after like 2010 are going to understand how to create media for its own sake, and to consume media not just for its own sake. But I think what gives me hope is that I feel like I'm in some ways the poster child of the problem, and I think it took one simple thing for me to stop and think about what the problem was, and that was to be forced to create for its own sake. And I think that's what these videos are, and I like that we don't really have a goal with them, because we aren't trying to, you know, do the Mr. Beast thing, as you would say, of getting famous for the sake of getting famous. In fact, I hope no one ever watches this video, because it's kind of just for me to figure out what I'm trying to do. But because I felt the need to make this video, and because I felt the need to create something for its own sake and not, you know, to put on my resume or to show someone so that they could think I was an intellectual, I'm forced to engage with the reality of my lack of original thinking. And in doing so, forced to reckon with the systems within which I operate on a day-to-day basis that are forcing me into a sort of unthinking mindset. I think the future lies in this desire to create that humans have so inherently. And if we can find a way to uninstrumentalize the desire to create, I think we could have so much fun. And I leave this video with a quick reference to the Anthropocene Reviewed, which, Jen, you introduced me to, and I've known you for like 5 years, and I never bothered to actually sit down and listen to the podcast or read the book. And I finally did this over the weekend because I had become so riddled with a lack of inspiration. And I realized that he's right. The ability to wonder is so profoundly human, and to lose that ability in the lack of absence would be such a profound failure. I think what I'm trying to remind myself is that even emptiness is full of something worthwhile, and in that emptiness we find our most beautiful ideas. Yeah. And so I'm going to keep making these videos, even though I don't really think I can come up with a thought that anyone would find interesting except for myself. Not because I think that I have something to say that someone needs to hear, but because if I can keep creating for its own sake, then maybe one day I'll want to push myself out of the cycle that doesn't care about the original thoughts. Anyways, I love you. Bye.